Alrighty, econ students, here we are with Module 65, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We're going to put our aggregate demand, our short-run aggregate supply, and our long-run aggregate supply curves all together by the end of this module. Alright, so we're focusing on this essential question of how do changes in aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply impact the economy? So that's what we really want to know. What happens when the aggregate demand curve shifts in the economy? And what happens when the short run aggregate supply curve shifts in the economy? And of course, when we mean impacting the economy, we are talking about in terms of what's going on with output or real GDP and what's going on with the unemployment rate. So we have this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which I'm never going to say that again. I always just say the ADAS model. And the purpose of this model is to understand the behavior of the economy and to analyze those economic fluctuations. A fluctuation is a change. So those economic changes. So, we are now familiar with the business cycle. We are familiar with the idea that the economy goes through good times and bad times and good times and bad times. So let's analyze why that happens. And then our next step after that will be to figure out or to learn about what the government can do to intervene in the economy if they feel like they should. All right, so we're going to answer such questions of why did the price level change? And why did consumers buy more or buy less? And why did producers produce more or produce less? All right, so here we have our axes here. So we're going to draw in our graph. And of course, we have price level over here on the y-axis and real GDP over here on the x-axis. Now, you will often see the real GDP. We know that it's also called output, and sometimes you'll just see it as like a little asterisk, that little star looking thing, and your book will put Y, because why not? All right, so we have our short run aggregate supply curve and our aggregate demand curve. And we are not yet going to include the long run aggregate supply curve. We will get there. All right, so, and then we put a dot, and that dot represents where the economy is if it's in that short run macroeconomic equilibrium. So if the dot is there, that means that the economy is in short run macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay, now let's break that down a little bit because that is a mouthful, right? So short run, meaning that, it's like a relatively short amount of time. We can think of it as like kind of less than a year-ish. And macroeconomic, we're talking about the entire economy. And equilibrium, remember, just like when we were talking about the regular supply and demand curves, that equilibrium point was where everything that got produced was also bought. Well, same thing with this big macroeconomic equilibrium, but instead we're not just talking about like one item or like one good or one service. We're talking about the entire economy. So what we want to know about this graph here, this graph right here, it tells us that the price level is at a point where buyers will buy everything that sellers will produce. So again, that market clearing thing. And we're going to give that a happy face because that's that's where we want to be. That's a good thing. I'm just going to adjust this. Okay. Well, let's go to page 2. All right, so we talked already about the fact that the aggregate demand curve can shift left and right. So when it does shift, they often call that demand shocks, all right, when it does shift. So this is kind of a little review from a couple of modules ago. A negative demand shock, that is called that is a decrease in aggregate demand, or you could just write AD to abbreviate it. And I hope that you guys remember that a decrease is a leftward shift. Okay, so let's draw that out. So we start by labeling price level, real GDP, short run aggregate supply curve, and the aggregate demand curve. And so this is our starting point. And so our equilibrium point, we can label that 1. So then that goes with this price level here, which we'll label price level 1. And that goes with this level of real GDP, so we will label that Y1. So that is where, the level of real GDP is in that economy at that time. All right. So we just said there's going to be a decrease in aggregate demand. So we draw our second aggregate demand curve to the left of our first one. So somewhere like that. And then we label it 82. And now we see that we now have a new equilibrium point, a second equilibrium point, which means that we now have a new price level and a new level of real GDP. So this graph here tells us something, right? Like this tells us a story. It's when aggregate demand decreases, well, then what happens? We see that the price level decreases and the level of real GDP decreases. So that's what we can write here. When aggregate demand decreases, comma, price level decreases and real GDP decreases. So what that is saying that in the economy, if there is that negative demand shock, meaning that for whatever reason, whatever one of those reasons we talked about, if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, it decreases, then the consequence of that will be that the price level in the whole economy will go down and the real GDP goes down. Now remember, real GDP going down means that businesses produce less goods and services. So that's that, but here we have a little review of our causes, right? Like a review of what could cause the aggregate demand curve to decrease. So if people feel the economy will get worse pretty soon, that means that they're going to stop spending their money. They're going to start saving it, which is a decrease in aggregate demand. And it also, I wrote people here, but we could also add in and businesses, because if they feel like the economy is going to start getting bad and people might not be buying their stuff as much anymore, then they're going to cut back on their own spending and investment as well. All right. So we also talked, this is from 2 modules ago, that if businesses have enough physical capital, meaning that they don't need to do that investment spending, they don't need to take out loans and build up their capital, then that can cause investment to go down and aggregate demand therefore to go down. And then fiscal policy, if the government starts to spend less money. Okay, so all of these 3 things are causes why the aggregate demand curve could shift to the left, why it could decrease. Now, remember, if people and businesses feel the economy will get worse, that's going to cause aggregate demand to decrease because it's going to cause consumption to decrease and investment to decrease. If businesses have enough physical capital, they will not be doing a lot of investment spending. That will cause investment to decrease. And then this one, of course, is government spending to decrease. So remember, C plus I plus G plus NX equals aggregate demand. So if any of these things decrease, aggregate demand will also decrease. All right, here we go. Our positive demand shock, which is an increase in aggregate demand. And of course, we all remember that an increase is to the right. So now we can go ahead and draw in our rightward shift on our graph. So we have price level, we have real GDP, we have short run aggregate supply, we have aggregate demand, we have that equilibrium point. And since this is all of our first stuff, we haven't made any changes yet. We have our first price level and our first level of real GDP. Now we draw in that increase in aggregate demand, so that rightward shift. So aggregate demand 2. Now we have our second equilibrium point with our second price level and our second real GDP point. So that tells us when aggregate demand goes up, we see that the price level goes up and real GDP goes up. Okay, so remember, aggregate demand increasing means that people and or businesses and or the government want to buy more stuff. They want to buy more stuff. So doesn't that sort of make sense that if like people are running out there and wanting to buy more stuff, that means the businesses can increase their prices on stuff and still sell it all. So they're gonna, because they're trying to make money. And then if people want to buy more stuff, real GDP will increase because the companies will start making more stuff because everyone wants to buy it, and then they can make more money. All right, so here are our causes of a aggregate demand increase. Causes of aggregate demand increase. Over here was the causes of aggregate demand decrease. So it's going to be kind of the opposite. So people feel that the economy will get better. And that's not just people, it's also people and businesses. And so if they feel like, who said there's no feelings in econ? There are. So if they feel like the economy is going to get better, then they're more willing to go out and spend their money. And so that would cause the C to go up and or the I to go up. All right, businesses need more physical capital. If they need more physical capital, then they're going to take out loans and they're going to spend money and they're going to be putting new buildings up and buying new stuff. So that would increase investment spending, therefore increase aggregate demand. And then fiscal policy, the government starts to spend more money. That will increase government spending, which would therefore increase aggregate demand. Okay, I'm going to stop it here and then we'll have a part 2.